Sarah had always been fond of adventure, so when her best friend, Emily, asked her to house sit for a weekend, she eagerly accepted. The house was located on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods, an old, towering structure that had been in Emily's family for generations. On the first night, as Sarah sat on the couch, she noticed something odd as shadow moving in the corner of her eye. She turned, but nothing was there. Dismissing it as fatigue, she continued reading, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As the evening wore on, strange noises filled the house, creaks from the floorboards, faint whispers in the distance, and the occasional tap-tap from upstairs. At midnight, the house went eerily silent, and Sarah was almost lulled into a false sense of comfort when the power suddenly went out. In the pitch-black darkness, she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Her breath hitched as the door to the living room creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, pale, hollow-eyed, and dressed in old-fashioned clothing. It looked like it had just stepped out of the past. "I'm here to stay," it whispered, its voice a rasp of gravel. Frozen with fear, Sarah backed away slowly. The figure's hollow gaze followed her, its movements jerky and unnatural. The temperature in the room plummeted as it stepped forward, and Sarah realized that the figure was no longer just a shadow of the past. It was something far worse. She tried to flee, but the door wouldn't open. The house felt like it was alive, trapping her. Every window was covered with thick, opaque sheets of fog. She could feel the eyes of something ancient, something malicious, watching her from every corner. In the morning, when Emily returned, she found Sarah's belongings scattered, the front door wide open, but no sign of Sarah herself. The house was quiet once more, but if you listened carefully on dark, stormy nights, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps pacing the halls of the old house. And perhaps, just perhaps, a soft whisper in.
Days turned into weeks, and the mysterious disappearance of Sarah became the talk of the town. Emily was devastated but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had always known there was something strange about her family's house, but she had never imagined it would claim someone as it had claimed Sarah. One evening, as Emily sat alone in her apartment, she received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah's phone, a single, chilling text: "Come back. You have to see." Emily's heart raced. The message was unmistakable. It was Sarah's voice, the same one that had once made her laugh during late-night talks. She couldn't ignore it. Despite every bone in her body telling her to stay away, Emily knew she had to return to the house. The moment she stepped onto the property, a sense of dread washed over her. The old house loomed like a dark sentinel, and the air was thick with an unnatural cold. The windows were dark, their glass eyes reflecting nothing but shadows. Emily hesitated at the door but finally pushed it open. Inside, the silence was deafening. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. She ventured through the living room, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpets. There was no sign of Sarah, but the air felt oppressive, as though something was lurking in the corners, watching her every move. Then, Emily heard Ita whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Downstairs." She followed the sound, feeling her legs tremble with each step she took toward the basement door. It creaked open, and Emily was greeted by an unbearable cold. The basement was shrouded in darkness, the walls lined with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror, its surface cracked, as if it had been shattered and hastily repaired. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Emily couldn't help but feel drawn to the mirror. Her reflection, though, didn't quite match her movements. It seemed slower, more deliberate, as though her reflection was waiting for something. Suddenly, her reflection grinned widely, maliciously, and then, the eyes of the figure in the mirror shifted to look at Emily. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, the voice not her own, but something far more ancient. Emily stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The reflection in the mirror began to move independently, reaching out as if to grab her. Panicked, she turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The temperature dropped even further, and she could hear soft whispers surrounding her, filling the room. She realized, with a jolt, that she wasn't alone. The house, the entity within, had been waiting for her, just as it had waited for Sarah. The basement door groaned open once more, and from the shadows, Sarah's voice echoed. "You're too late," it said, but this time, it wasn't Sarah who spoke. It was the thing that had taken her. Emily turned in horror, and there, in the corner, stood Sarah, but her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, and her movements jerky and unnatural. "It's my turn now," Sarah's voice croaked. The figure, once her best friend, reached out with long, bony fingers. With every ounce of strength left in her, Emily bolted up the stairs. She screamed for help, but the house swallowed her voice. The wall seemed to pulse, and as she reached the front door, it slammed shut with terrifying force. The house wouldn't let her go. Emily realized, in a gut-wrenching moment of clarity, that she wasn't just trapped in the house. She was becoming part of it. From that night on, the house remained still. The whispers faded. But sometimes, on stormy nights, locals swear they can hear faint footsteps echoing in the woods near the house, as though a summer thing is still searching for a way out. And if you listen closely, you might hear two voices, one faint and desperate, the other dark and knowing, whispering together in the wind we're here to stay.
Weeks passed, and Emily's disappearance became another chilling story the townsfolk would whisper about when the wind howled through the trees. The house, standing silent in the distance, seemed to have absorbed all the grief and fear that had surrounded it. It was no longer just a house, it was a vessel of dark secrets, trapping the souls of those who dared enter. But one evening, as the moon cast a pale light on the house, a curious figure approached the front door. Thomas, a local historian and a distant relative of Emily, had heard the rumors, and something deep within him tugged at his curiosity. He had always been fascinated by the history of the house, and the strange events surrounding it had never been fully explained. With a flashlight in hand and determination in his step, Thomas crossed the threshold of the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. At first, the house was eerily calm, just as it had been in the weeks since Emily's disappearance. There was no whispering, no sounds of footsteps. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting. As Thomas ventured deeper, the feeling of unease grew stronger, settling in his chest like a heavy weight. He reached the living room, where the old furniture sat covered in dust, untouched for years. The air was thick, stale, as if the house hadn't been truly lived in for a long time. Thomas turned his flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, and he froze. In the corner of the room, next to the cracked mirror, was a faint silhouette. It was standing still, but its form seemed almost wrong, as though it was trying to hold on to its shape, but failing. The figure swayed slightly, and then, in an instant, it turned, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. His instincts screamed for him to run, to turn and leave the house behind, but his legs felt like lead. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered in a voice that sounded both like Sarah and Emily, but twisted, as though the two voices were merging into one. With a jolt, Thomas snapped back to reality. He knew he had to leave, but the house didn't want him to. The walls seemed to close in around him, pushing him deeper into its dark embrace. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices calling to him from the shadows. Thomas stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as he turned and ran toward the door. But when he reached the hallway, it was gone. The door, once just a few steps away, was now distant, shrouded in thick fog. He could hear the footsteps more than one set echoing in the halls behind him. The house was alive, hungry, and it was chasing him. With every turn, the house shifted, its walls folding in on themselves, moving like a labyrinth. There was no escape, no way out, and with each passing second, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was in pain. Finally, Thomas reached the basement door. He hadn't meant to come here, but something had drawn him in, something he couldn't resist. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house. As he stepped down, his flashlight illuminated the old mirror at the center of the room, cracked and broken. But what he saw in the reflection wasn't just his own frightened face. Sarah and Emily stood there, their eyes empty, their bodies twisted and wrong. They were reaching out, beckoning him closer. "We're all here, Thomas," their voices whispered together as one. "It's your turn now." Before he could react, the mirror seemed to ripple like a disturbed pool of water. A cold, ethereal hand reached out, grabbing him by the wrist. He struggled, but the grip tightened, pulling him closer to the glass. "Don't resist," the voices murmured. "You belong to the house now." With one final scream, Thomas was dragged into the mirror, his body twisting in a horrific, unnatural way. As he disappeared into the depths of the glass, the room fell silent again. The house once more was still. Days later, the townspeople noticed something strange. The house, long abandoned, now had a faint glow from within. When anyone passed by, they could hear soft, indistinct whispers drifting from the windows, almost like a lullaby, but with a chilling undertone. And if you happened to look closely enough, you might see the faint outlines of three figures standing in the shadows: Sarah, Emily, and Thomas, forever trapped in the mirror, their eyes pleading, but silent. The house had claimed them all, and it would never be empty again. "We're all here to stay," the whispers would say, as the wind carried their voices into the night.